Picture a machine so useless on its very first outing that most of it never even made it to the enemy. Engines overheated, tracks snapped, vehicles sank into mud up to their hulls and simply stopped. Engines still running, crews trapped inside a metal box that had become their coffin on wheels that didn't even turn. And yet, out of that disastrous debut, an entire century of warfare would be rewritten. This is the story of a weapon that was born not out of brilliance, but out of desperation. A machine designed to solve a problem so simple to describe and so impossibly hard to fix that it had already killed millions of men before anyone found an answer. How do you cross a few hundred meters of open ground when that ground is laced with barbed wire, pockmarked with shell craters, and swept every single second by machine guns that can fire 600 rounds a minute? That question is where the tank begins. To understand why anyone needed to invent a rolling steel box in the first place, you have to understand what the battlefields of 1914 had become. When the First World War started, European generals were still thinking in terms of cavalry charges, sweeping maneuvers, wars that would be, in the words so many of them used at the time, over by Christmas. Armies expected movement. What they got, within a matter of months, was the opposite: a static, grinding stalemate stretching from the Belgian coast to the Swiss border, a scar of trenches nearly 800 kilometers long. Soldiers dug in because digging in was the only way to survive, and once both sides had dug in, offense became almost suicidal. An infantryman, climbing out of a trench to advance across no man's land, was walking into a killing zone with no cover, no speed, and no protection, against defenders who had every advantage: fixed positions, pre-registered artillery, and above all, the machine gun. A single well-placed gun crew could cut down an entire wave of attackers before they'd covered 50 meters. Artillery bombardments meant to soften up enemy lines before an attack often did the opposite of what commanders hoped. They churned the ground into a moonscape of mud and craters that made it even harder for their own men to advance afterward, while giving defenders time to bring up reserves. Battle after battle produced casualty figures that are almost impossible to process as anything other than abstract numbers. Tens of thousands of dead in a single day, hundreds of thousands over a single campaign for territorial gains that could sometimes be measured in mere meters. Barbed wire alone deserves a moment of attention here, because it's easy to underestimate just how much of the stalemate came down to something as unglamorous as tangled metal thread. Belts of wire, often dozens of meters deep, were strung in front of trench lines specifically to slow down and funnel attacking infantry into predictable killing lanes, where machine guns and artillery observers were waiting with pre-calculated ranges. Cutting through that wire under fire at night while carrying rifles and equipment was its own brutal sub-discipline of trench warfare, and countless attacks collapsed simply because the wire hadn't been cleared properly beforehand. Combine that with mud so deep and pervasive that men and horses sometimes drowned in it, with trench systems that stretched back in overlapping, mutually supporting lines rather than a single wall to break through, and with artillery capable of reducing an advancing formation to almost nothing in minutes, and it becomes easier to understand why this particular war produced such a uniquely grinding, static form of combat. Unlike almost anything armies had experienced before it, the war had become a machine for consuming young men, and every general on every side understood at some level that conventional infantry tactics were not going to break this deadlock. What they needed was something that bullets couldn't stop, that barbed wire couldn't hold, that craters and trenches couldn't block. They needed, in essence, a vehicle immune to the very weapons that had made offense impossible. That vehicle didn't exist yet, but the idea of it had already been floating around for years, waiting for technology to catch up to imagination. The dream of an armored, self-propelled war machine wasn't new in 1914. Visionaries and inventors had sketched versions of it for centuries, from Leonardo da Vinci's conceptual armored cart to 19th-century proposals for steam-powered land ironclads. What had always been missing were three things at once: an engine powerful and compact enough to move armor plate, a way of gripping the ground that could handle mud and trenches rather than getting stuck like a wheeled vehicle would, and an industrial base capable of manufacturing something this complicated at scale. By the early 20th century, two of those pieces had quietly fallen into place, thanks to agriculture rather than the military. Farmers, particularly in North America, had begun using continuous track systems, caterpillar treads, on tractors, because tracks distributed a vehicle's weight over a much larger surface area than wheels, letting heavy machinery cross soft or uneven farmland without sinking in. It was a mundane, unglamorous piece of agricultural engineering. Nobody designing a tractor track in 1905 was thinking about trench warfare. But a handful of engineers and officers in Britain looked at those tractors and saw something else entirely: a way to carry armor and guns across terrain that would trap any ordinary vehicle. In Britain, the push to turn this idea into a weapon came from an unlikely direction: the Royal Navy, not the Army. Winston Churchill, who at the time headed the Admiralty, became one of the strongest early champions of the concept. He didn't invent the tank himself, but he used his political position to protect and fund the project when the army showed little interest, and he helped establish what became known as the Land Ships Committee, a body specifically tasked with investigating armored, tracked land ships that might do at sea level, on solid ground. Something like what a warship does on water: combine mobility, protection and firepower into a single moving platform. Engineers, including William Tritton, who ran an agricultural machinery company, and Walter Gordon Wilson, a naval officer with an engineering background, took on the practical work of turning committee discussions into an actual, functioning prototype. It was not a smooth process. Early experiments were clumsy, underpowered, and prone to mechanical failure, which is more or less what you'd expect when you're trying to invent an entirely new category of vehicle from scratch under wartime pressure with 1915-era engineering. The first real prototype to come out of this effort was a vehicle nicknamed Little Willie, built in 1915. It proved the fundamental concept: an engine, tracks and armor plate could indeed move together as a single machine. But Little Willie had a serious flaw for the job it needed to do. Its track shape meant it struggled to actually climb up and over the wide trenches and parapets that defined the Western Front. Solving that problem meant rethinking the entire shape of the vehicle. The answer, and this is one of those design decisions that seems obvious in hindsight but took real ingenuity to arrive at, was to run the tracks all the way around an elongated, roughly rhomboid, diamond-shaped hull. By wrapping the tracks around the whole outline of the vehicle rather than mounting them like wheels underneath a body, engineers gave the tank an enormous reach. As it approached a trench, the long, curved nose of the track would tip downward into the gap, grip the far side, and effectively pull the whole vehicle up and across, the way a caterpillar might flow itself over an obstacle rather than simply rolling over it. The experimental vehicle that proved this new shape worked was nicknamed Mother, and Mother's rhomboid silhouette became the direct ancestor of the first tank put into production, the Mark I. And here's a small detail that tends to surprise people: the name tank itself has nothing to do with what the machine actually is. It's a cover story that stuck. Because Britain wanted to keep this new weapon a complete secret from German intelligence while it was being built, workers at the factories were told, and the shipping crates were labelled, as if they were producing large water tanks or mobile fuel containers for the front. A plausible, boring bit of wartime logistics that wouldn't draw attention. The deception worked so well, in fact, That the code name simply never got replaced with something more descriptive once the secret was out. A weapon that would go on to define land warfare for the rest of the 20th century ended up permanently named after the box someone used to smuggle it past enemy spies. So what was it actually like to be inside a Mark I? Understanding this matters, because it's easy to look at old photographs of these machines and think of them purely as engineering triumphs, without registering just how brutal an experience they were to operate. The Mark I had no rotating turret, the feature we now consider almost the defining visual signature of a tank. Instead, its guns were mounted in bulging armored boxes on either side of the hull, called sponsons, which meant the crew had to physically maneuver or even partially reposition the whole vehicle to bring weapons to bear on a target in a different direction, rather than simply swinging a turret. Inside, conditions were close to unbearable. The engine sat directly in the crew compartment with no separating bulkhead, which meant the men inside were sharing their working space with a roaring, unshielded combustion engine. The heat, the noise, and the exhaust fumes all filled the same cramped metal box the crew occupied. Carbon monoxide poisoning was a genuine hazard. Temperatures inside could soar past what any modern safety standard would tolerate. The noise was so overwhelming that crews often couldn't communicate by voice at all and had to resort to hand signals or physically striking each other to pass along simple instructions. Visibility out of the vehicle was almost non-existent. Thin slits in the armor, easily obscured by mud, smoke, or the simple business of just trying to see anything at all while being violently jolted around inside a machine with essentially no suspension. And even the interior of the armor plating posed a danger to the crew. When a bullet struck the outside of the hull without penetrating it, the impact could still cause small fragments of metal, called spall, to break off the inside surface and spray through the crew compartment like shrapnel, meaning men could be wounded or killed by a shot that technically never got through the armor at all. Driving one of these things required a small team working in coordination, and even then, the vehicles were mechanically fragile, prone to overheating, breaking tracks, and simply giving up in the middle of the battlefield. That was the machine, untested in combat, uncomfortable to the point of danger for its own crews, mechanically unreliable, that Britain committed to using for the first time on the 15th of September 1916 during the Battle of Flers-Courcelette, part of the broader Somme offensive. It is hard to overstate how much of a gamble this was. Nobody, including the men who built these vehicles, really knew how they would perform once actual combat conditions. Artillery fire, difficult terrain, the chaos of a real battle were added to the equation. And the results, honestly, were underwhelming by almost any conventional measure of, does this weapon work? Dozens of tanks were committed to the attack, but a large share of them broke down mechanically before they ever reached enemy lines, done in by their own unreliability rather than by German fire. Others became stuck in shell craters or particularly soft ground, immobilized and useless. Some were hit and knocked out by artillery. Only a relatively small fraction of the tanks deployed that day actually made it into contact with German positions and performed anything resembling their intended role. Judged purely as a tactical weapon deployed on a single day, September 15th, 1916 does not look like a triumph. But something important happened anyway, something that goes beyond that day's narrow tactical scorecard. For the German soldiers holding those positions, many of whom had never seen anything like this before, the appearance of large armored machines grinding forward through no man's land, apparently indifferent to rifle and machine gun fire, was genuinely shocking. Contemporary accounts describe confusion, even a kind of superstitious dread, among defenders confronted with a weapon that simply didn't behave like anything the war had produced up to that point. And more importantly, for the first time in years of static warfare, a weapon had demonstrated that the trench system, that supposedly impenetrable line of mud, wire and machine guns, was not in fact invulnerable. The tank hadn't broken the Western Front open on its own that day, not remotely, but it had proven a concept. It had shown, in however rough and unreliable a form, that mobile, protected firepower could survive and advance where infantry alone could only die trying. Every flaw revealed on the Somme, the mechanical breakdowns, the poor visibility, the vulnerability to artillery, the lack of coordination with supporting infantry, became, essentially, a design and doctrine problem to be solved, rather than proof that the whole concept was a dead end. And engineers on both sides of the conflict, along with the French, who had been developing their own parallel tank programs, got to work solving them. The improvement curve after that first rough debut was remarkably fast, which tells you something about how motivated everyone suddenly was. Britain moved from the Mark I through a series of Mark variants, ironing out reliability problems and improving crew conditions with each iteration. The Mark IV, in particular, addressed many of the earlier vehicle's most glaring weaknesses. France, meanwhile, was pursuing its own tank designs largely independently, and by November 1917, the British had accumulated enough improved tanks and enough tactical lessons to attempt something far more ambitious than the Somme's scattered, largely improvised deployment: a massed, concentrated tank assault at the Battle of Cambrai. Hundreds of tanks were committed together in coordination with infantry and artillery support, in an offensive specifically designed around what a tank force could achieve when used en masse and properly integrated with other arms, rather than sprinkled thinly across a battlefield as an afterthought. The initial results were genuinely dramatic. The attack achieved rapid, significant gains, breaking through German lines in a way infantry alone had rarely managed anywhere on the Western Front over the preceding 3 years. It looked, for a moment, like exactly the breakthrough everyone had been hoping for. Ultimately, mechanical attrition, logistical strain, and a strong German counterattack meant Cambrai didn't produce a permanent, war-ending breakthrough either. But as a proof of concept for what concentrated combined arms armored warfare could achieve, it was enormously influential, and military thinkers across Europe took careful notes. While the British and Germans were fighting a war of increasingly refined but still fundamentally similar rhomboid land battleships, France was quietly working on something that would turn out to matter more in the long run than either the Mark series or Cambrai itself. That something was the Renault FT, and if you want to point to a single vehicle as the true ancestor of every modern tank, this is probably it. The Renault FT abandoned the giant, low, wire-crossing rhomboid shape entirely in favor of something much closer to what we picture when we picture a tank today. A smaller, lighter, more mechanically agile vehicle, with the driver positioned at the front, the engine mounted at the rear, and, critically, its main weapon housed in a fully rotating turret on top of the hull, rather than fixed in side sponsons. That turret arrangement might sound like a small detail, but it was a genuine conceptual leap. It meant a crew could engage a threat in almost any direction without needing to reposition or reorient the entire vehicle, dramatically improving both tactical flexibility and crew survivability. The front engine, rear drive, or in this case rear engine rotating turret layout, the Renault FT pioneered became, in one form or another, the basic architectural template that essentially every subsequent tank design in history would follow, right up through the vehicles rolling off production lines today. It's a strange thing to think about. The great lumbering Mark I, for all its historic significance as the very first tank ever to see combat, was in some sense a technological dead end in terms of its actual shape, while the smaller, less famous Renault FT quietly established the blueprint the entire rest of tank history would build on, So, having covered how the tank came to exist and how its basic form settled into something recognizable, it's worth pausing to actually explain what a tank is doing, mechanically and conceptually, and why its core design choices work the way they do. At its heart, a tank is an attempt to combine three qualities that, throughout most of military history, existed in tension with one another: firepower, protection, and mobility. Increase one, and you typically sacrifice another. Pile on more armor, and the vehicle gets heavier, slower, and harder to transport. Mount a bigger gun, and you usually need a larger, heavier turret and hull to support its recoil and ammunition, which again adds weight and cost. Push for more speed and agility, and you often have to accept thinner armor or a smaller gun to keep the vehicle light enough to move quickly. Every tank ever built represents a specific set of trade-offs among these three qualities, shaped by the doctrine, budget, industrial capacity, and battlefield priorities of the nation that built it. The tracks solve the mobility half of the equation by spreading a heavy vehicle's weight over a large ground contact area, which is why a multi-ton tank can cross soft or broken terrain that would instantly bog down a similarly heavy wheeled vehicle. Think of how snowshoes let a person walk across deep snow by distributing their weight rather than sinking with each step the way ordinary boots would. The armored hull and turret solve, to whatever extent the specific design allows, the protection half, shielding the crew and vital mechanical components from small arms fire, shell fragments, and in more sophisticated designs from direct hits by enemy tank guns and anti-tank weapons. And the gun, historically evolving from small-caliber weapons meant mainly to suppress infantry, toward large-caliber high-velocity cannons specifically designed to punch through enemy armor at long range, solves the firepower half, giving the tank the ability not just to survive on the battlefield, but to actually destroy other armored vehicles, fortified positions, and enemy personnel. A tank, in other words, isn't really one invention. It's an ongoing engineering negotiation between three competing demands. And the entire subsequent history of tank development is really the story of engineers and military planners in different countries reaching different conclusions about how to balance that negotiation. There are a few more pieces of that engineering puzzle worth understanding because they explain a lot of what looks, from the outside, like strange or counterintuitive design choices. Take the gun itself. Modern tank cannons are almost always smooth-bore rather than rifled, meaning the interior of the barrel has no spiral grooves cut into it. That might seem like a step backward, since rifling is what gives a bullet from a rifle its stabilizing spin. But at the velocities and ranges modern tank ammunition operates at, a smooth-bore barrel actually allows for a different, often more effective kind of ammunition. Long, dart-like penetrators, stabilized in flight by small fins rather than spin, similar in principle to a thrown dart or a crossbow bolt. These penetrators rely on sheer kinetic energy and a very narrow, concentrated point of impact to punch through enemy armor rather than an explosive warhead. Alongside these kinetic rounds, tanks also carry high explosive and shaped charge ammunition, designed less to punch through armor via brute force, and more to focus an explosive jet of superheated metal into a narrow point, capable of burning through even thick plate. Choosing which round to load, and when, is one of the small but consequential decisions a tank crew makes constantly in combat. Then there's the question of crew roles. A typical modern main battle tank carries a crew of 3 or 4, usually a commander, a gunner, a driver, and sometimes a loader, each with a distinct job that has to be performed under pressure in a cramped, often deafening environment, while the vehicle itself may be moving across rough terrain at speed. Coordinating those roles smoothly, especially under fire, is as much a matter of training and teamwork as it is of raw technology. a fact that hasn't really changed since the earliest, most chaotic days of the Mark I. That negotiation played out very differently once the guns of the First World War fell silent and militaries around the world had to decide what exactly this new weapon was actually for. This turned into a real and consequential argument, not just an academic one. One camp, often more traditional in outlook, saw the tank as essentially a support tool for infantry, a way to help foot soldiers punch through fortified positions, moving at roughly walking pace alongside advancing troops, providing mobile firepower and a degree of protection, but never really operating independently or at speed. The other camp, and this is where things get more interesting from a historical standpoint, argued for something far more radical, that tanks used in large, concentrated formations and combined with fast-moving supporting elements like motorized infantry, artillery, engineers, reconnaissance units, and eventually aircraft, all tied together by that relatively new and transformative technology, radio communication, could do far more than simply support an infantry advance. They could spearhead an offensive entirely, punching through enemy lines at a chosen weak point and then racing deep into the enemy's rear before defenders had any chance to reorganize, disrupting command structures, supply lines, and reserves faster than the enemy could react. Military theorists in several countries wrote about these ideas during the interwar decades, but it was Germany rebuilding its military under the constraints and then the abandonment of the Treaty of Versailles that most aggressively adopted and refined this second, more radical vision, tightly integrating tanks with aircraft, motorized infantry, and rapid, decentralized command decisions. The world got to see exactly what that theory looked like in practice starting in 1939 and 1940, when Germany invaded Poland and then France. What made the German approach so devastating in those campaigns wasn't primarily that German tanks, the various Panzer models, were individually superior machines to what Poland, France, or Britain could field. In many respects, French tanks of the period actually had thicker armor than their German counterparts. What made the difference was coordination and operational speed. The sheer degree to which German armored formations, radio-linked and supported by close air cooperation with the Luftwaffe, could identify a weak point in enemy lines, concentrate overwhelming force at that single spot, break through, and then keep moving, deep and fast, before the defending army could even figure out where the main threat actually was, let alone organize an effective response. This approach earned the name Blitzkrieg, Lightning War, and it turned the tank from merely a powerful individual weapon into the spearhead of an entirely new, integrated way of waging war, one where speed and coordination mattered as much as, or more than, raw armor thickness or gun caliber. France, a country that had spent the interwar years building the extraordinarily elaborate Maginot Line of static fortifications specifically to prevent a repeat of 1914-style trench slaughter, fell in a matter of weeks, a result that shocked observers around the world and instantly made every major military power reconsider its own doctrine around armored warfare. Once the broader Second World War was fully underway, tank development turned into something close to a full-blown arms race, with each major combatant nation pushing its designs in somewhat different directions based on differing industrial capacities, doctrines, and battlefield experiences. The Soviet Union produced the T-34, a design that's still widely regarded by historians and engineers as one of the most influential tank designs of the entire war. Not necessarily because any single one of its individual features was unmatched, but because of how well its overall package balanced protection, mobility, firepower, and, crucially, the ability to be manufactured cheaply and quickly in enormous numbers. Its sloped armor is a particularly clever piece of engineering. Angling armor plate rather than mounting it vertically effectively increases the distance an incoming shell has to travel through the metal to penetrate it, while also increasing the chance that a shell will simply glance off rather than striking the plate straight on, similar to how a bullet fired at a steep angle into a pond is more likely to skip off the surface than one fired straight down into the water. The United States, for its part, built the M4 Sherman, a tank that rarely wins arguments about which individual wartime tank was the single best in a straight one-on-one duel against German heavy tanks, but that became invaluable precisely because of qualities that don't show up in a simple stat comparison. It was reliable, relatively easy to manufacture at massive scale, simple enough to maintain and repair in the field, and standardized enough that American and Allied logistics chains could keep enormous numbers of them running, fueled, and supplied across multiple theaters of war simultaneously. Germany, meanwhile, pursued a philosophy that increasingly emphasized individual vehicle superiority. Tanks like the Panther and the Tiger carried formidable guns and thick armor capable of outmatching almost anything the Allies or Soviets could put against them in a direct one-on-one engagement. But that superiority came at a steep cost. These vehicles were expensive and complicated to manufacture, mechanically finicky, difficult to keep supplied and running, and produced in far smaller numbers than their Soviet or American counterparts. Britain, meanwhile, spent much of the war cycling through a series of cruiser and infantry tank designs that were often plagued by mechanical unreliability or underpowered guns, a persistent frustration for British crews who frequently found themselves outgunned in North Africa and later in Europe, until American Sherman tanks, supplied in huge numbers, and eventually the much-improved British Comet and Centurion designs closed that gap. On the other side of the world, Japan's tank program never really caught up to the standards being set in Europe. Japanese doctrine emphasized infantry support roles and light vehicles suited to the terrain and logistics of the Pacific theater, and Japanese tanks were frequently outclassed by the American armor they eventually encountered on islands across the Pacific. And running underneath all of these national programs was a less visible but enormously consequential story: industrial capacity. The Soviet Union's ability to relocate entire tank factories eastward, beyond the reach of German bombers, and keep producing T-34s by the tens of thousands, even in the darkest years of the war, mattered just as much to the war's outcome as any single tactical innovation. The United States similarly leveraged its automobile industry's assembly line expertise to churn out Shermans faster than almost anyone thought possible, then shipped huge quantities of them not just to its own forces, but to Britain and the Soviet Union under Lend-Lease agreements, effectively multiplying Allied armored strength through sheer manufacturing muscle. This contrast reveals something that turns out to be one of the most important and recurring lessons in the entire history of armored warfare: that the best tank isn't necessarily the one that wins a hypothetical one-on-one duel in a controlled test. It's the one that shows up in sufficient numbers, reliably fueled, properly maintained, crewed by well-trained soldiers, and supported by a logistics chain capable of recovering and repairing damaged vehicles rather than simply writing them off. Armor thickness and gun caliber matter enormously, but so does something far less glamorous. Whether there are enough spare parts, mechanics, and fuel trucks to keep a tank force actually moving and fighting for weeks and months at a stretch, rather than just for a single dramatic engagement. When the Second World War ended and gave way to the decades-long standoff of the Cold War, tank design underwent another significant shift in thinking. The pre-war and wartime categories of light, medium, and heavy tanks, vehicles built for distinctly different roles, from fast reconnaissance to heavily armored breakthrough duty, gradually converged into a single, more versatile concept: the main battle tank, a vehicle intended to combine firepower, protection and mobility all in one design, good enough to handle most of the roles that used to require several specialized types of vehicle. Iconic Cold War-era designs like the Soviet T-54 and T-55, and later the T-72, the West German Leopard 2, the British Challenger, and the American M1 Abrams, all represent different national answers to this same underlying challenge. Build one vehicle rather than several specialized ones, capable of engaging enemy armor at long range, surviving hits from enemy weapons, and moving fast enough to keep pace with the increasingly mechanized and fast-moving armies of the later 20th century. This Cold War arms race also played out vividly in a string of regional and proxy conflicts around the globe, from the Arab-Israeli wars to Korea and Vietnam, each of which became something of a live-fire laboratory for competing tank designs and doctrines. The 1973 Yom Kippur War, in particular, is often cited by military historians as a turning point. Israeli armored formations, initially caught off guard, suffered heavy losses to Egyptian and Syrian infantry equipped with man-portable anti-tank guided missiles. A shock that forced armies worldwide to seriously reconsider just how vulnerable even the most advanced tanks could be to inexpensive, widely distributed weapons in the hands of well-drilled infantry. Design philosophies also diverged along broader geopolitical lines during this period. Soviet doctrine tended to favor tanks that were smaller, lower to the ground, and cheaper to mass produce, prioritizing sheer numbers and a low profile that made them harder to spot and hit, even if that came at some cost to crew comfort and, in certain respects, survivability once a shell did find its mark. Western designs, by contrast, particularly the American Abrams and British Challenger, tended to prioritize crew protection and survivability even more heavily, incorporating features like blowout panels engineered to vent the force of an ammunition explosion safely away from the crew compartment rather than letting it detonate inward. Neither approach was simply correct. They reflected different assumptions about how a future war would actually be fought, how many tanks each side expected to be able to build and replace, and how much value each military culture placed on protecting individual crews versus fielding overwhelming numbers. These vehicles incorporated steady advances that would have seemed almost like science fiction to a Mark I crew from 1916, gun stabilization systems allowing accurate fire even while the tank itself is moving across rough ground, sophisticated fire control computers that calculate range, wind and target movement almost instantly, thermal imaging sensors letting crews see and engage targets at night or through smoke and dust, and increasingly advanced composite armor designs engineered specifically to defeat both kinetic penetrators and shaped charge warheads. And yet, even as tanks were becoming more sophisticated and more lethal than ever, an entirely new category of threat was emerging that would, again and again, prompt observers to declare the tank obsolete. Guided anti-tank missiles, capable of being carried and fired by a single infantryman or a small vehicle-mounted team, gave relatively cheap, portable weapons the ability to destroy an extremely expensive tank with a single well-aimed shot from well beyond the tank's own effective range, particularly if that shot struck the tank's comparatively thin top or rear armor rather than its heavily protected front. Attack helicopters added another dimension entirely. Able to hover, use terrain to mask their approach, and then pop up briefly to fire guided missiles down onto a tank's weakest points from angles ground-based armor was never really designed to defend against. Each new generation of anti-tank weaponry has at various points since roughly the 1970s prompted confident predictions from military analysts and journalists that the age of the tank was finally definitively over. That a weapon costing a few $1,000s had rendered a machine costing millions obsolete overnight. And yet, In conflict after conflict, tanks kept getting built, kept getting deployed, and kept demonstrating that they still offered something genuinely difficult to replace. A mobile, heavily protected platform capable of delivering direct, accurate, sustained firepower while physically occupying and holding ground in a way that missiles, aircraft, and artillery, for all their own advantages, simply cannot do on their own. The tank didn't disappear. It adapted, gained better armor, better sensors, and in some designs, active protection systems specifically engineered to detect and intercept incoming missiles before they even strike the vehicle. Which brings the story to where things stand today, and to a battlefield environment that would probably be almost as alien to a Cold War tank crew as a Cold War tank would have been to the men who fought at Cambrai. Recent conflicts have made painfully clear that cheap, widely available drones, precision-guided artillery, extensive minefields, and a battlefield saturated with constant aerial and satellite surveillance have made it far easier than ever before to spot, track, and strike large concentrations of armored vehicles, particularly when those vehicles attempt to operate the way 20th century doctrine once envisioned. Massed together, advancing rapidly, somewhat exposed. This does not mean the tank, as a category of weapon, is disappearing, but it does appear to mark the end of the idea that a tank, or even a large formation of tanks, can safely operate in isolation without dense coordinated support from infantry, air defense systems, electronic warfare units to jam or disrupt enemy drones, engineers to clear mines and obstacles, reconnaissance, and a resilient logistics chain capable of keeping fuel, ammunition, and spare parts flowing forward under threat. The tank's survival, in other words, now depends more than ever on everything around it, rather than on the vehicle alone. Recent fighting in Ukraine has made this lesson almost impossible to ignore. Footage of tanks and armored columns being tracked and destroyed by cheap first-person view drones, some costing only a few $100s, has circulated widely, and it has forced military planners around the world to confront just how exposed even the most advanced armor can be when the sky above it is saturated with small, hard-to-shoot-down aerial threats constantly relaying video back to an operator kilometers away. Minefields laid in dense, overlapping belts have similarly blunted several major armored offensives, showing that even a weapon as old and unglamorous as the landmine still has a significant role to play against modern armor when used at scale. None of this has erased the tank's usefulness. In the same conflict, tanks have also proven essential for breaking through fortified positions, providing direct fire support and holding ground once it's been taken, tasks that drones and artillery alone still can't fully replace. But it has sharpened the lesson that armies learned gradually across the 20th century and are now relearning quickly in the 21st. A tank operating without dense support from air defense, electronic warfare, and infantry is a tank operating on borrowed time. Looking toward the next generation of tank design, engineers are increasingly focused on active protection systems that can detect and physically destroy incoming projectiles and missiles before impact, networks of distributed sensors that let a tank see threats well beyond what its crew could spot with their own eyes, integrated drones. The tank itself can launch for reconnaissance or even attack, unmanned turret designs that let crews sit lower and better protected within the hull. Smaller crews overall, as automation takes over more functions, and deeper digital integration linking each individual tank into a broader, real-time network of other vehicles, aircraft and command systems on the battlefield. There's a certain irony sitting at the center of the tank's entire 100-plus-year story, and it's worth sitting with for a moment before we close things out. The tank was invented to solve a very specific, very narrow problem. How does a soldier survive walking across open, exposed ground in the face of concentrated enemy fire? And in that narrow sense, It succeeded spectacularly and continues to succeed today. But the broader trajectory of its development shows something else entirely, that the more capable and sophisticated the individual machine becomes, the more it depends on everything around it to actually survive and function on a real battlefield. The lone, self-sufficient Mark I, lumbering forward on its own in 1916, has given way to a highly networked system of systems, a vehicle that is only as effective as the infantry protecting its flanks, the air defense units watching the sky above it, the engineers clearing the ground ahead of it, and the logistics chains keeping fuel and ammunition flowing behind it. The tank's history, in the end, isn't really just the story of one weapon's steady mechanical evolution from a slow, half-broken experiment into a networked, sensor-laden machine capable of firing accurately on the move at targets kilometers away. It's the story of an ongoing, unresolved competition between mobility and defense, between visibility and concealment, between innovation and vulnerability. A competition that started in the mud of the Somme in 1916, and if the pace of the last century is anything to go by, shows absolutely no sign of ending anytime soon. And that, in a way, might be the truest thing you can say about the tank. It was never really the final answer to the battlefield's oldest problem. It was just the next question.